This past summer, a group of us, me and 3 friends, 2 women and another guy, were bored of just sitting around doing nothing, so we decided to go for a hike. I suggested a place I knew about in the countryside where a river meets a small stream. There's a crossing there that leads to a trail going up the mountain to a little pond. On the way, we stopped at a gas station to grab some snacks, drinks, and smokes. The drive was smooth, good vibes all around. When we arrived, there were 2 women near the trail entrance. They seemed really nervous, but we didn't think much of it because we were all a bit buzzed. As we got out, I lit a cigarette and one of the women in our group asked for one. I handed her one and noticed the other woman had these super long, dirty fingernails. It was odd, but I shrugged it off, figuring they might be wanderers or free-spirited types. We started hiking and everything seemed fine. About 15 minutes away from the pond, we noticed 3 men standing off the trail, staring into a hole in the ground about 50 to 100 feet away. They hadn't noticed us because we were joking around and laughing loudly. It was unsettling, but we kept going. Once we reached the pond, we sat down to relax and lit up a blunt. While we were chilling, one of the guys wandered along the edge of the pond, scanning the bank for interesting stuff. He ended up finding a hatchet, clean, almost unnaturally clean, half buried in the dirt. Nearby, about 5 feet away, was an empty can of acetone and a Ziploc bag filled with blood. My friend, who's usually unshakable, was visibly disturbed. First, he didn't say anything and just sat back down with us. After a while, he called us over to see what he'd found. The girls freaked out. One even threw up. I used my shirt to pick up the hatchet, thinking it might be evidence of something serious, but it was spotless, likely cleaned with the acetone. Then I noticed a number written in Sharpie on the blood bag, 19. That really rattled me. I suggested we leave everything and head back. As we walked back, one of the men we'd seen earlier emerged from the bushes just off the trail. He was sweating and looked agitated. Trying to stay calm, I greeted him and asked what he was up to. He said he'd lost his keys the night before and was searching for them. I recognized him immediately by his jacket. It was definitely the same guy. The other 2 men weren't around. He started asking questions, including why one of the girls looked upset. My friend told him to back off and that we didn't want any trouble. The guy lingered for a moment, then started walking behind us, pretending to look for his keys but clearly watching us. We picked up the pace and eventually he stopped following. As we neared the parking lot, we saw the other 2 men sitting by our car, peering inside. I told the girls to stay back by a bench while my friend and I approached. When we asked what they were doing, they gave us the nastiest looks I'd ever seen. One of them, a smaller guy, stepped toward my friend with a smirk and made a disgusting comment about the girls. Without thinking, I punched him in the jaw. The other guy started reaching for something in his pocket, but my friend tackled him to the ground. Suddenly, I heard the girls scream. The man in the jacket was approaching them, just a few feet away from the bench. The girls managed to unlock the car and run toward us. We all jumped in as fast as we could. My friend and I fought off the guys enough to get away, but not before my buddy landed a solid kick to the jacket guy's face, knocking him out cold. We drove home in silence, too shaken to talk. A few days later, one of the girls called me and told me 2 local kids had gone missing the same day we were at the hiking spot. Their homes were only a few miles from where we'd been. None of us reported anything to the police, afraid we'd somehow get implicated. To this day, I don't know if we stumbled upon something criminal or just a series of freaky coincidences, but it still haunts me. If we hadn't acted when we did, I hate to think what could have happened. This story actually belongs to my stepmom and her close friend. I have my own experiences too, but I'm hesitant to share them just yet. I'm hoping that retelling their story might help ease me into sharing my own. My stepmom didn't always get along with us as kids, but she shared this story with my older sister and me when we were younger, partly to scare us into being careful and avoiding dangerous situations. It became the go-to stranger danger story in my family. My stepmom, who I'll call Laura, was a bit of a spoiled teenager in the late 1970s. Her family moved to the US from Australia when she was around 8 or 9. She attended a good high school in a small, picturesque town and made friends with a girl named Anna. Anna wasn't part of Laura's usual circle of popular, trendy kids, but they got along well. Anna introduced Laura to outdoor activities like hiking, fishing, and camping, things Laura would never have done on her own. There's even a hilarious photo of Laura on a camping trip, looking miserable with smudged mascara and a scowl. One Sunday, when Laura and Anna were about 16 and 17, they decided to hike in some hills about an hour from their town. Laura laced up what were undoubtedly expensive hiking boots, and the two of them drove to the trailhead. Anna parked in a large dirt clearing with simple wooden markers for parking spaces. They were the only car there, though that fact didn't seem important at the time. Instead of following the trail, Anna decided they should blaze their own path up the hill, which annoyed Laura. The hike wasn't remarkable except for Laura's constant complaints about the heat and bugs. By the time they reached the top, Laura was done and insisted on resting before heading back down. On their way down, they opted to follow the road rather than the uneven trail, hoping for an easier descent. Not long after, an old, rusty blue pickup truck pulled up beside them. The driver, a man with a scruffy beard, long unkempt hair, and a baseball cap, rolled down the passenger window. He greeted them with a friendly smile and asked if they needed a ride back to their car. Laura found him charming, even attractive, and despite Anna's unease, Laura convinced her to accept the ride since it was only supposed to be a short drive. The girls climbed in after the man directed them to sit in the back seat. The truck smelled of dirt and old wood, and there was a coil of rope on the floor along with several rolls of plastic sheeting poking out from under the front seat. Anna noticed these details immediately but kept quiet, not wanting to alarm Laura. As they drove, Anna's discomfort grew. When she asked how much longer it would be, the man casually replied that he was taking a different route and needed to stop somewhere first. After another 10 minutes, the truck pulled into a clearing with a small, weathered cabin. There was a stump with an axe embedded in it near the cabin door. The man told them to stay put while he went inside to grab something. As soon as he disappeared into the cabin, Anna turned to Laura, urging her to get out of the truck. Laura, worried about appearing rude, hesitated. Frustrated, Anna followed her back to the truck and tried again to convince her to leave. That's when they spotted something that froze them both. A hatchet on the floor under the driver's seat, its blade stained with what looked like dried blood. Finally realizing the danger they were in, the girls bolted into the woods, running as fast as they could. They didn't stop until they were deep enough into the forest that the cabin was no longer visible. Anna led them in what she hoped was the direction of the trailhead, all the while trying to calm Laura, who was sobbing uncontrollably. When they reached the edge of the parking area, they spotted their car, but the truck was there too, parked facing the opposite direction. They ducked behind some bushes to observe. After a few tense minutes, they saw the man emerge from the back seat of their car. He shut the door, scanned the woods, and then walked back to his truck. The girls waited, holding their breath, until he drove off. As soon as he was out of sight, they sprinted to their car, jumped in, and sped away without even closing their doors properly. They didn't stop driving until they were safely back home, shaking and overwhelmed by what had just happened. A while back, my boyfriend and I were lounging at home, feeling bored, when we decided to go on a hike. Hiking wasn't something we did often, but the idea sounded appealing. Even though there was just under an hour of daylight left, We figured it would be enough time for a short hike before it got dark. We quickly filled our water bottles, grabbed the sturdiest shoes we had, and headed out the door. Driving into the hills near my area, we passed several trails. Most of the time, we stuck to the lower paths where others usually walked, but that day we decided to venture farther up the hillside. A friend had once mentioned a trail farther along, and we thought it would be fun to try it. Keeping the time in mind, we figured we'd explore a bit, enjoy the scenery, and head back before it got too late. When we arrived, the starting point of the trail was empty. There weren't any other cars parked nearby. It seemed a little unusual, but we brushed it off since it was late in the day. We estimated we still had about 45 minutes before nightfall, so we set off. The trail began with a steep downhill slope, followed by an equally steep climb back up. After that, the path evened out, making for an easier walk. We spotted a lone coyote off in the distance and a few rabbits darting around nearby. I joked about how the rabbits should watch out for the coyote, earning a playful shove from my boyfriend. About half a mile into the trail, we came across a large fallen tree stretched across a dry stream bed. It looked sturdy, so we climbed on it, rested for a while, and took some photos before continuing. A little further down the path, I heard something rustling in the bushes behind us. The sound startled me, but we kept going. Whatever caused it seemed larger than a rabbit, which made me uneasy. Soon after, I decided it was time to turn back. The sun was starting to set, and the light was fading fast. My boyfriend agreed, and we turned around to head back to the car. When we reached the fallen tree again, my boyfriend stopped to tie his shoelace. While doing so, he glanced back along the trail. For the first time, we noticed someone. A figure dressed in black, with a hood pulled over their head, walking at a steady pace far behind us. It didn't seem strange at first. After all, lots of people wear dark clothes, especially when it's cold. But something about the person's presence made my boyfriend more alert. He told me about the figure, and we decided to pick up our pace. As we moved through a winding section of the trail, we lost sight of the figure and assumed they had fallen behind. But soon after, we saw them again, this time much closer, only about 50 feet away. This startled us, especially since we had been walking faster. Without exchanging a word, we both instinctively started to run. With the trailhead now within sight, we slowed briefly to catch our breath. My boyfriend turned around and saw the figure again. This time, they abruptly stopped running when he looked back, as if trying to seem like they were just walking. Alarmed, he shouted, "Go!" And we both sprinted downhill. The fading light barely penetrated the dense trees around us. The steep downhill path made it hard to run without stumbling, but we pushed forward, slipping on loose rocks and brushing against overgrown branches. Somehow, we avoided falling. We didn't dare look back. When we reached the bottom, we faced the final uphill climb back to the trailhead. Pushing ourselves, we made it up the incline and reached the car. My boyfriend jumped in and started the engine, his hands trembling. As he reversed onto the road, the figure appeared at the edge of the trail. For the first time, we got a clear look at them. The hood had slipped off, revealing a pale face and lifeless eyes. They were breathing heavily and holding something in their hand, though it was too dark to make out what it was. We didn't stick around to find out. My boyfriend shifted into drive and sped off, leaving the figure standing in the dim light of the trailhead lantern, fading into the distance behind us. Earlier this spring, I decided to go camping in a forest about 4 hours away from my home. There was a small, peaceful lake I often visited, quiet and secluded, almost like a hidden gem. It was the perfect escape whenever I needed a break from everything. When I arrived and set up camp on the first day, the place was completely empty, which was typical. The lake wasn't very large and was bordered by a grassy shore, with dense woods surrounding it. From my campsite, I could see the entire lake. Not long after I finished setting up, I noticed someone emerge from the woods on the far side. It was a man who pitched his tent not far from the shore. He looked like an ordinary camper, minding his own business at first. As the sun began to set, I noticed him making his way around the lake toward my campsite. He approached with a friendly smile and introduced himself as Thomas. He mentioned he'd spotted me from across the lake and thought he'd come over to say hello since it was rare for anyone else to be out here. We started chatting and quickly found common ground. Thomas said he was 27, close to my age, and told me he liked this place because of how quiet it was. After about half an hour of conversation, he went back to his side of the lake as night began to fall. The next morning, we crossed paths again and ended up hanging out for most of the day. Thomas brought over a few beers, and we sat by the shore, exchanging stories and enjoying the calm atmosphere. By evening, we returned to our separate campsites. As I sat by my small campfire later that night, I thought about how great it was to meet someone like Thomas. He seemed like the ideal camping companion. It was getting late, so I began preparing to extinguish the fire and head to bed. That's when I noticed Thomas walking toward me again. His campfire had gone out earlier, so I assumed he'd already turned in for the night. But there he was. "Hey, everything okay?" I asked as he walked up. He smiled, looking like his usual self, and said he'd found a spot with an incredible view and thought I might want to see it. I hesitated, mentioning how late it was, but he insisted that it was worth checking out at night. His excitement was contagious, and I figured, why not? Camping is all about adventure, right? I followed Thomas to the other side of the lake, and soon we were walking through the woods. There was no trail, and I realized Thomas must have been here before to navigate so confidently in the dark. After about 15 minutes, he slowed down and pointed ahead, saying, "There it is." When I stepped forward to look, I didn't see a scenic view. Instead, there was an old, weathered RV, abandoned and covered in moss. Rust had eaten away at the sides, and it looked like it hadn't been touched in years. Confused, I turned to Thomas, but his demeanor had changed. His expression was cold and distant. He didn't look like the same person. "What is this?" I asked nervously. He didn't reply. Suddenly, I heard the creak of a rusty door swinging open behind me. Before I could process what was happening, someone else rushed out of the RV. My instincts took over, and I bolted into the woods. I could hear Thomas and the other person chasing after me, but I pushed myself to run faster, weaving through the trees until their footsteps faded. By the time I stopped, I was completely lost. The forest seemed endless, and I had no idea where I was. I kept moving through the darkness, using the faint light of dawn to guide me. Eventually, I found my way back to the lake, but when I reached my campsite, everything was gone. It looked as though I'd never been there. I stayed hidden and made my way back to the main trail, then to my car. Once I was safe, I reported the incident to the local authorities, but they didn't seem particularly concerned. They never mentioned finding anything, and I doubted they even searched. Thinking about what might have happened that night still sends chills down my spine, but I'm grateful I managed to escape before finding out. I was trekking along a route I'd discovered in Evergreen Mountain Reserve. It was a round-trip trail that typically took 3 days to reach the end and 3 days to return. I didn't know much about the trail or how frequented it was, but with these long backpacking journeys, you rarely encounter many people anyway. On the 3rd day of my hike, I passed by one of the campsites and noticed a man sitting by his tent. I decided to take a break, and we chatted for a bit. He mentioned he was staying there for the night and planned to head to the trail's summit the next day. I told him I was heading there that same day and might see him when he arrived. Shortly after, I continued on my way and reached what would be my campsite for the next 2 nights. The view was breathtaking. something I had never experienced before, and made the journey worth it. For the rest of the day, I didn't see anyone pass through. When night fell, I realized I was still the only one camping there. I thought about the man I'd met at the campsite a day behind me. He had said he would reach the summit that day, but he never arrived. I figured he might have decided to turn back or spend another day at the campsite where we'd met. The next morning, I packed up to head back the way I'd come, though I got a late start. My goal was to at least reach the same campsite where I'd seen the man. I was unusually sore, which slowed me down, and before I realized it, the sun had set. I put on my headlamp and continued walking for about an hour after dark until I reached the campsite. The man's tent was still there, set up just as it had been, as though he had never left. Knowing he planned to move on and aware that staying at one site for days while backpacking is unusual, I called out to see if he was okay. There was no response. I moved closer and said I just wanted to check on him. The flap of his tent was partially open, but it was empty inside. A chill ran through me, and I felt uneasy. I looked around, but there was no sign of him anywhere, until I noticed a faint glimmer in the distance. A dim light flickered far off in the woods. Curious, I walked toward it, going about 40 yards from the tent. The source turned out to be a headlamp lying on the ground, its light so weak it was almost out of batteries. That's when I realized someone was watching me. About 10 yards away, a figure stood, clearly trying to stay hidden. My gut told me this wasn't the man I had met. Feeling unnerved but trying to stay calm, I called out, "Hello? Do you need help?" The person didn't move or respond. "I'm sorry, I'll leave," I stammered, then quickly returned to the tent. Fortunately, I hadn't unpacked my gear yet, so I threw on my backpack and started walking away. As I left the campsite, the faint light in the woods suddenly turned off. I kept moving, covering another 3 miles to the next campsite. Once I had signal, I reported what had happened. Unfortunately, it turned out to be as I had feared. The man I'd met was missing. There were barely any clues for authorities to follow, and in such remote wilderness, searches are incredibly challenging. Whoever that person was out there remains the biggest mystery. They may hold the key to understanding what happened, though most people suspect the worst. There's a forest near the small town where I grew up, filled with trails and camping spots. A few years ago, I visited my family for a week and decided to go camping. The gear I had wasn't fancy, but I wasn't planning anything extreme. Just wanted to find a quiet spot and camp for a night or two. I picked a random trail and followed it. I knew most trails in this area led to a pond a few miles in, so I thought I'd end up there. But by the time I hit mile 5 or 6, I realized it was going somewhere else. I was intrigued to see where it led, but after hours of walking, it felt like I was on an endless path that went nowhere. Eventually, my legs started to tire, so I found a small clearing off the trail to set up camp. It was almost dusk, so I was racing against the setting sun to get everything in place and start a fire. I managed to get the fire going just in time, lighting up a good distance around the campsite, but not enough to go further than 15 to 20 feet from my tent. I sat down, boiled some water, and made some tea to relax for the night. It's hard to tell the time out there, but after about an hour, it was well past dark when I heard someone walking down the trail. At first, I thought it might be an animal, but as they got closer, I could tell it was definitely a person. I couldn't make out much detail, but I could see a tall figure with a backpack. They didn't stop, just kept walking down the trail past my campsite. The sound of their footsteps faded into the distance. It struck me as strange that they didn't have a flashlight and were out hiking so late at night. But they had a large backpack, so I figured they knew what they were doing, and I didn't think much more of it. I stayed by the fire for another hour before letting it burn out and getting into my tent to try and sleep. A few hours later, I woke up needing to pee. I tried to ignore it, but I couldn't get comfortable. So I unzipped the tent, stepped out, and walked about 20 feet from the campsite. After finishing, I turned to go back, but I noticed something out of the corner of my eye. In the dim moonlight, I couldn't make it out clearly, but I knew it was a person. I walked cautiously back to the tent, scanning the trees around me. I reached in for my backpack, grabbed my flashlight, and turned it on. Immediately, I saw a figure standing by the trail. It was the same tall person I had seen earlier, but as soon as they noticed the light, they quickly darted behind a tree, vanishing into the shadows. It went silent again. I sat there for a moment, shining the flashlight around but seeing nothing. It was clear to me then that I needed to leave, fast. I packed up what I could, leaving behind my cheap tent, and started walking back down the trail. When I reached the spot where I'd seen the person, I was even more frightened. There was no sign of them anywhere. I didn't know if they were still watching me or if they had followed me, but I kept my flashlight on and moved cautiously through the trees, scanning every shadow. As I continued, the sky started to lighten with the first signs of dawn. I made it back without incident, but when I got home, I looked up the trail I had taken. I found out it wasn't even an official trail, it was just an unmarked path. Maybe it had been someone like me, just wandering off the beaten track. But that still doesn't explain why they were stalking my camp. How long had they been watching me? I can't shake the feeling that night was supposed to be my last. The fact that I left when I did is probably the only reason I made it out safely.